So today we're really delighted to welcome Professor Henrietta Harrison to discuss the perils of interpreting. This book has received widespread critical acclaim and was indeed a History Today Book of the Year. One reviewer described The Perils of Interpreting as a book that thoroughly transforms what we know about Sino-British encounters leading up to the Opium War. I read this and really enjoyed it, I should say. So my personal recommendation comes with this. It's so readable and such an exciting immersion into a global world of language, translation, trade, empire, science. It does it with such facility and such elegance. It's just an absolute pleasure to read it. So, do if you haven't read it already, do go and read it. So joining Professor Harrison today are two experts who will provide their own insights on the book: Professor Adrian Gregory from Pembroke College and Professor Todd Hall at the far end from St Anne's College. Adrian is our chair of proceedings and will guide us through both today's discussion and this particularly fascinating period of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm not going to hold us up for any length of time because I think we would like to hear more from Henrietta than from me. So first of all, I'm going to ask Henrietta to read a little from the book, whichever section you feel like doing. And then I will make a very brief response, and then I will hand over to Todd, who is actually far more the expert in this area than I am. I think I'm here as a historian who Henrietta has often spoken to at lunch more than anything else, but I will try my best to provide useful comment. So Henrietta, please.
Hello everyone. I thought I'd start by reading from the introduction, because this is a book with a lot of characters, and the introduction is a place where you get to meet these characters. So, early one morning in the late summer of 1793, George Macartney, Earl of Lissenor, Britain's first ambassador to China, dressed in the robes of the Order of the Bath, with ostrich plumes nodding over his head, knelt before the Qianlong Emperor and held up in both hands above his head a gold box set with diamonds containing a letter from George III. Qianlong was the descendant of Manchu warriors who had conquered China in the 17th century. He spoke Chinese and Manchu and was proud of the fact that he could speak enough Mongol, Tibetan and Uyghur to receive envoys from those areas without the need for an interpreter. But on this occasion, an interpreter was essential. Macartney, who'd made a grand tour of Europe in his youth, spoke in Italian. His words were expressed in Chinese by a younger man kneeling behind him, who had given his name as Plum and was dressed in a British uniform and a powdered wig, but was in fact Li Zibiao, a Catholic from China's far northwest. Li had been educated in Naples, and he spoke Chinese simply rather than in the formal language of the court, but with deep respect for the emperor and a certain attractive sincerity that was characteristic of him. When he turned to Macartney, he conveyed the emperor's remarks in elegant, formal Italian. The emperor listened to a brief speech, asked a few polite questions, and presented Macartney with a jade scepter. When Macartney withdrew, his place was taken by his deputy, George Leonard Staunton, a Jesuit-educated Protestant Irishman who was an enthusiast for the scientific discoveries of the age, a follower of Rousseau, a slave owner, a supporter of the recent French Revolution, and Macartney's long-standing friend, secretary and henchman. The great project of Staunton's life was the education of his son, 12-year-old George Thomas, who now knelt beside him. Lee still interpreted, this time into Latin, but George Thomas could understand both sides of the brief conversation. His father had been speaking in Latin to him since he was 3. And since his first meeting with Lee the previous year, George Thomas had also been studying Chinese. When the emperor asked if any of the British could speak Chinese, his chief minister, He Shun, who had met Staunton earlier and had a gift for knowing what might amuse the elderly emperor, told him that the boy could speak a little and called him forward. George Thomas was shy, but when the emperor took out a yellow silk purse that was hanging at his waist as a gift, he managed to get out a few words of thanks in Chinese. From beside the throne, 3 of the most powerful men in the land looked on. the prince who would soon come to the throne as the Jiaqing Emperor, Fukangan, the emperor's favourite general who'd recently returned from a successful campaign against the Gurkhas in Tibet, as well as He Shun, who controlled the emperor's finances. There was also Song Yun, a Mongol who had originally trained as a Manchu-Mongol interpreter and had just arrived back from the northern frontier, where he had been renegotiating the Second Commercial Treaty of Kyakhta with the Russians. After the audience and the banquet that followed, Qianlong ordered Fukangan, He Shun and Song Yun to give Macartney a tour of the gardens. And while Macartney found He Shun evasive and Fukangan arrogant, he had served in Russia himself and enjoyed Song Yun's enthusiastic questions about Russian politics and government. This is one of the most famous moments in the history of China's encounter with the West, and the Qianlong Emperor, in history and in life, has always dominated the scene. He was in his 80s at this time, simply dressed in dark robes, sitting cross-legged on his throne, but he'd been the autocratic ruler of a vast empire for nearly 50 years. Even He Shun and Fukangan knelt down when they spoke to him, and he liked to be complimented on the fact that his was one of the most glorious reigns in Chinese history, with rapid population growth after a century of warfare that had surrounded the fall of the previous dynasty. Agriculture and trade were flourishing. The Qing Empire had reached its greatest size with the completion of the campaigns against the Mongols and Dzungars in the northwest, and the arts and scholarships were flourishing under his patronage. Far away on the south coast of China, Europeans had been drawn in by their desire for China's manufactures, fine silk and porcelain that could not be replicated in Europe. More recently, the trade with the British had boomed as Europeans and Americans acquired a taste for tea, a crop grown only at that time in China. After the audience, Qianlong decisively refused the British requests for a resident ambassador in Beijing and an island off the coast as a trading base. Soon, people in Europe were saying that he had done so out of anger, that Macartney had merely knelt on one knee, rather than bowing his head to the ground 9 times in the full court ritual of the kowtow. Ever since, Qianlong has been blamed for the failure of the embassy. As the son of heaven who claimed to be the ruler of the civilized world and knew nothing of rising British power, he had failed to realise that Macartney was anything more than an envoy sent by a distant king to bring him tribute. However, if we turn our gaze away from Qianlong and look instead at the other people who were present, the embassy is transformed. This is a book about the interpreters, Li Zibiao, who interpreted for Lord Macartney, and little George Thomas Staunton, who got a lot of credit because his father wrote the book about the embassy. They are fascinating figures because they were impressive linguists who became extremely knowledgeable and well-informed about the others' cultures, and also came to have a real affection for them. Both first travelled in childhood, and as a result came to understand the other's culture with a particular fluency. This was intensified because they were isolated from their natural peer group during crucial periods. Li, because he was much younger than the other Chinese students at his Catholic seminary in Naples, and Staunton, because when he was sent to work in the East India Company's establishment in Canton, the young Englishmen there resented the appointment of someone from outside their own social circle. This isolation encouraged both Li and Staunton to form unusually strong cross-cultural friendships as teenagers and young adults, which then shaped the way they saw the world in later life. Both were often homesick, and neither ever thought of himself as other than a foreigner in the other's continent. But after they returned home, they were not quite like other people there either.
Thank you. So I think for those who haven't yet had a chance to read this, this gives a wonderful flavour of the book. And I think, if I'm understanding the remit correctly, I think Henrietta, more than anything, has asked me to participate in this as a historian with an interest in global history. Now I've sort of gradually worked my way outwards from being a historian of Britain to a historian of Europe, and then to thinking about the global dimension of things. But my actual topic and subject area is the era of the First World War. So that's what I work on. But I think I'd like to sort of comment on 2 levels really. One of them is my admiration for the craft involved in this. I was checking with Henrietta beforehand. I think we're fairly confident that this involved archival work in 5 nations, in 4 different languages, which is itself, I think, an extraordinary feat. And I think the linguistic facility comment about her translators. I think I don't think you were intending it as autobiography, but I think it's a fascinating reflection. It's a book also that spans the globe, really. I mean, there's moments in this book where it's engaging with what's happening in India, what's happening in the North American colonies. So it's a very particular moment, which I'll come back to in a while, of this extraordinarily emergent, interconnected 18th century world in which the Anglo Chinese relationship, and it should be said that it's an Anglo-Chinese relationship, but it's also an Anglo-Irish Manchu Chinese relationship. So there's a fascinating, and indeed, I mean, if you think about the Hanoverian dynasty, I mean, although George III sees himself as absolutely 100% English, he's not that far removed from being a foreign dynasty in the way that the Qing are. So there are all these fascinating sort of parallels and connections. But I think I'd like to sort of comment a little bit on sort of, if you like, the meta history aspects of this, and the thinking about history involved in something like this. And there's a particular historian who I like enormously, is William Sewell, who's a historian of France and the French Revolution. So in some ways, parallel historical period to this. But he also is somebody who's been embedded in social science departments in the United States. And Sewell writes a book in which he says that actually the thing that is distinctive that historians bring to the understanding of human affairs, and it sounds incredibly old-fashioned in some ways, he said what historians really do very well is they think about events. Now, events not just being stuff that happens, but events being things that historians can find meaning and significance in terms of understanding the world. And this is one of my first reactions to this, and although also from conversations with Henrietta, and of course the Macartney embassy has always been there in a sense as a historical event. And in the sort of big world history narratives, there's this sort of idea that this is a very particular sort of hinge moment, which is this terrible tragicomedy of arrogance and miscommunication as a sort of hinge of the rise and decline of great powers. Here we have, Qing China at the height of its power, failing to recognise that there is this new kid on the block. And as I say, Henrietta talks about this in the introduction. Now, I think actually scholarship had already begun to probe away at that for a while. But I think what's fascinating in what Henrietta does is that she takes the same event, the same hinge moment, but then completely reconfigures what it signifies by thinking about it not in terms of the Emperor and Macartney, and indeed Macartney's role as the ambassador of British power, but through these two translators. And these two young men who have these sort of fascinating childhood, youth experiences, then provide a very different way of thinking about this event as not being something that is an absolute hinge point, but which is a way station along a longer process of global transformation, where a particular kind of interconnected 18th century world, which is rather fluid in terms of culture and power, begins to give way to an increasingly sort of rigid set of distinctions between imperial power and nationalist reaction. And then, of course, this feeds in, into the question of, which has now become, I think, quite central to the way that historians think, which is not only event, but also memory. In other words, that this is also a book that is reflecting on what gets remembered and what doesn't get remembered. And again, I suppose that's somewhere I come into this a little bit, having worked on historical memory quite a bit myself in the past. And again, she says, actually these people are never completely forgotten, but they become marginalised in a very particular version of this story. Whereas by focusing on the translators, by focusing on these young men and their long lives, really. You can see another story about the alterations that occur over time. I feel I've used enough of our time on this, and so at this point I think I'd like to hand over to someone who's far more qualified really to speak about this than I am, which
No,
is Todd.
I wouldn't say that I'm qualified. I'm a scholar of international relations with a strong interest in China. And I've also come to serve as the director of the China Center. And in that position, I've been brought into contact with research work that's far beyond the remit of my narrow focus on contemporary foreign policy of China, and have found myself continually a student. And in this case, I very happily have learned so much from this. And so I first want to say congratulations again. It's an amazing piece of work, and it tells a wonderful narrative of a variety of different human experiences with a level of detail that for that era is just so amazing. And you can just imagine the amount of work. And I imagine there's probably 1,000 other stories that are not in here that you would have wanted to include, or other people or other characters that you found that you would have wanted to have in this as well. And so the amount of work that must have gone into this is just absolutely amazing. But you tell, on the one hand, it would be completely and totally readable as a story and a narrative of a certain set of lives at a certain period in history. But that's not all you do with it. And you bring it into conversation with things that are going on and themes going on in the present. And you make a number of very salient points that spoke to me in things that I'm doing right now. And I just want to touch upon those. One, of course, is you make the point about lost knowledge and how there is knowledge, and there can be knowledge at various levels, but it can be ignored or overlooked or also forgotten. And right now in the UK, there's a strong push to do what's called China capabilities building. And that is an idea that you're building knowledge about the People's Republic of China. And it's an idea that you're helping people get more familiarity who are in decision-making positions in order to be able to understand what's going on, understand how to make sense of things that the People's Republic of China might be doing, how the government works, etc. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, you read this and you realize that the relationship between Britain and China goes back so long, and yet there's been a repeated ways in which it's always been sort of a forgotten relationship, or a relationship that is constantly, there's so much knowledge, but also at the same time, a repeated need to reestablish that knowledge. But I would say, and apart from also, the lessons that you offer on, I don't know if they're good examples or cautionary examples on parenting, in terms of how you raise your children and what educational regimens you put them through. I also wanted to say, and I don't know if I've shared the story with you, is that you're actually an inspiration for something that happened not shortly after the book was published, and there was an article published in Foreign Affairs about China becoming ready to attack Taiwan. And in this article, the people who wrote this, they're themselves seen as China specialists. They said that one of the pieces of evidence they used was that Xi Jinping has told his generals that they need to dare to fight, right? And taking in that context, it does sound like evidence that he's telling them that they should prepare for war. The issue is if you go back to the original translation, it's Gang Yu Dou Zheng, which actually is a very different term. The Gan Yu Dou Zheng is actually, Dou Zheng is another way of translating it is dare to struggle. And that struggle, the Dou Zheng, that term actually is the same term that you'd use for class struggle or struggle for, any types of the struggle against corruption, the struggle against, it's a broad term that has a long...
Like
yeah, well, but it has it's not religious. But
but it has. It also means struggle and can mean struggle in many.
But it has a very ideological overtone. It's not something that you'd say to somebody on the in a sports competition. You wouldn't yell out "Gan Yu Dou Zheng" as somebody's racing to finish their sports competition. It's a very jargony ideological phrase that draws upon a longer history. Mao used the phrase. Others have used the phrase, and within the PRC, they're even promoting Dou Zheng Jingshen, the spirit of struggling. which can mean all sorts of things, which has a very broad meaning. And the meaning of that could also be read as just preparing for a difficult time ahead, and you need to steel yourself, you need to be prepared for difficulties. But they chose to translate it as dare to fight. And having read this, not actually shortly encountered that, I reached out to a think tank in Washington and a fellow scholar, and we put together a translation note that went through the whole history and contested this and everything. And it was in some ways inspiration based on what you're writing, because it is these themes, it gets to the oft-used quote that, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the amount of rhymes that you're able to find in this are absolutely amazing. And so, again, all I can say is congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Henry, do you want to respond to any of this first before we throw it open to questions? Or?
Well, there were all sorts of things I could talk about, obviously. If I just kind of go through generally, well, I think maybe taking your first point and Todd's last point, the whole issue of language is obviously central to this book. It was constructed through multiple languages, but it's also about how languages interrelate. And how the crucial importance in diplomatic practice of going between one language and the other. And part of it's literally about explaining sometimes to people who don't do this a lot themselves that there aren't equivalent words for things in other languages necessarily. Some of the times there are, and some of the times there aren't. And I think people who don't necessarily speak multiple languages often have an idea that you can say the thing you said in Chinese directly in English and you won't change anything. And of course that's wildly not true. George Thomas Staunton, who's the little boy when he grows up, he spends his life trying to explain this to people. While there may be equivalence between relatively closely related languages with similar cultures, European languages, for example, there's very often very little direct equivalence between Chinese and English, and therefore you are going to have to rearrange and rewrite the words. And one of the examples of this that comes up in the book is that when George Staunton was translating documents from Chinese into English, he talked about he translated the term 盖国王, which is literally that country's king, into His Majesty King George III. Now, the question is, if you were writing diplomatic correspondence of the period and you were writing it in English, you would never say that country's king. And assuming that your correspondence is intended to be courteous and that it's clear from the rest of what you've said that you're intending to be courteous, you should write a courteous style of English as a correct translation of that. I mean, you may not be, you may be intentionally being rude, but it might not be the case. So these terms, and that he then becomes more troubled about doing that as Robert Morrison, who's the first English missionary, turns up, and his enthusiasm is why he's there is to start translating the Bible into Chinese. And for the Bible, he feels that no paraphrase is possible. So with the Bible, you must have every word. And so he's thus wanting every word to have a direct and correct equivalent. And so that means that he produces a kind of English. When he's translating Chinese, his English sounds very strange, very oriental, very distant, very unlike anything we would normally say. Whereas in these 18th century people, when they translate, they they make George Staunton and Li Zibiao make, well, George Staunton very particularly, because we've got a lot of his translation, it's clear that he makes Chinese officials sound like 18th century English gentlemen. And that makes them convincing and proper. And this, of course, is a big issue in China at the moment, because the current Chinese government has a list of words, which we actually had an undergraduate who was a couple of years ago, who did a lot of the first line translation. So it's an undergraduate in the BA Chinese, and she was doing very good undergraduate, and she'd been employed by the Chinese government to do the kind of very basic first level of translation for Xi Jinping documents, and they literally issue a list of this word must be translated like this and this word must be translated like that. And the trouble is that when you do that, you get a very, very strange English, and it becomes very hard to express. It becomes hard for us to believe that if we only see it in Chinese and we get struggle suddenly in there. We're not thinking of what that meant. In fact, it would almost have been better as fight hard for in a kind of totally metaphorical way would have been would have looked better in English. So, but that degree of control over translation is deeply problematic. So I think this kind of language, the use of language in diplomacy and in our knowledge of the West and our knowledge of the outside world is very much what the book's about, as well as being one of the tools for creating it. I also noticed that Adrian mentioned the role of the Irish, and I'm actually felt bad about this as I went through. You may have heard me hesitate on the word Protestant, because this is the one error that's going to be corrected in the second edition, is it turns out that George Staunton was in fact Catholic. George Leonard Staunton was in fact an Irish Catholic, concealing his Catholic background. And I went on after I've subsequently been writing about the impact of that Catholicism in his world. So he's from Galway, he's an Irish Catholic. And Irish historians know this because they knew that anyone educated in a European Jesuit college would kind of have to be Catholic. You couldn't get into such an institution in France without a baptism certificate. Which doesn't, I mean, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, but he never actually switched. Or at least there's no evidence for him ever converting. So he seems to have just floated from one to the other. But this is a story. The people in the Macartney embassy absolutely saw it as partly an Irish activity and about presenting Ireland to the wider world. And it got written into the grand historical narratives of world history as Britain and China, but its participants are definitely thinking they take Irish tabinets, which are or Irish wool silk mix, and that's what they actually turn up with to present to the emperor. The East India Company has sent them with loads and loads of wonderful British woolens.
It's interesting because it is before the Act of Union. So, you know, they're there on behalf of the monarch of Great Britain and Ireland as separate entities. So there's a kind of...
And I mean, Macartney is an Ulster Protestant and Staunton is an Irish Catholic, but they both, and that's one of the reasons why they're willing to use a Catholic interpreter. Because many people ask me, you know, isn't it strange for the Protestant British to be using a Catholic priest, which is what Lord Zibiao is, as their interpreter. But part of the reason they're willing to do that is that they're Irish. And although we think of Ireland as a place where Catholicism and Protestantism have extremely hard lines between them due to the more recent situation, in the 18th century, particularly for elites, that's not necessarily the case. So, and that's part, I guess, of one of the ways in which what Adrian was talking about, this way system, the idea that things change gradually, but that there's a really quite drastic change. And this is something that I have less evidence for, but really feel quite strongly that as the British take control in India, their attitudes towards the Chinese are transformed, so that in the 18th century, yes, you were saying that you were interested in chinoiserie. In the 18th century, there's a lot of interest in the Chinese as people that we might look up to, a nation of philosophers, guided by philosophers. And particularly if you were educated in a French Jesuit seminary and you had all these things to read about, early Catholic Jesuit missionaries in China, romantic tales and exciting stories. When you get that kind of background, you can look very positively towards the Chinese. Whereas, so when they first arrive in China, and they arrive just off the shore, and some Chinese officials, one's a deputy general, forget what the hell is in the British Army, and the other's a Dao Tai, which really doesn't have, but anyway, quite kind of senior level official, are sent out to their ship to meet them. And when Macartney and Staunton meet these people, they all have a wonderful time, and they drink cherry brandy together. They dine together on the food that the Chinese have provided, because the English have run out of food after their long sea voyage. And then when they leave, they all shake hands, and it's this very positive. They try out the little boy interpreting, and they were delighted to discover this works. It's this very positive experience they describe very positively. About 20 years later, when the next embassy turns up, they get the same rank of officials. And things have changed a bit in China over those 20 years. So the Qianlong emperor, whose court was full of glamour and beautiful costumes, has been succeeded by his son and heir, the Qing emperor, who is a much more downbeat, careful, frugal sort of character. So people are not quite so glamorous as they were. But nevertheless, when the British meet the official, but exactly the same rank of officials are sent to deal with them. And their response is, well, these people smelled so terrible that we couldn't go near them. And it was a real trial to us to approach them and examine their costume. We've got a kind of set of racist ideas that are really not there in the way they're dealing with the people 20 years earlier. And it's a very, very striking example of a transition that takes place around 1900, and that seems to be driven by that British occupation of India. Yes, it's sad to say that the UK is still engaged in capabilities building on China, as it has been really since I started in the profession. I mean, it is to our advantage that the UK is always endlessly trying to engage in this, but it's also striking that so the Jesuits, the European Jesuits, when they went to China in the 18th, 17th, starting in the 16th century, they worked up the most extraordinary knowledge of the Chinese language. They're writing really elaborate books on things like the I Ching, the Classic of Changes, which is an incredibly difficult text to understand. To be able to write books on that in Chinese, you have to have an extraordinary understanding of it. And yet in England, 100 years later, people are trying to understand Chinese by deciphering it like it was code. You know, like we were looking at hieroglyphs, because that knowledge gets entirely lost. There are, in fact, sailors. Chinese sailors are still turning up, and that was one of the fascinating. I really enjoyed looking at some of the British archives where you get these. Looking up China as a code search, as a search term, doesn't work, because you get lots of things about people breaking and stealing porcelain. but actually, there are Chinese sailors. If you look up China and Wapping, then you discover the Chinese sailors who are coming over at that time, living these really international lives very, very early. And there's some really interesting research that's coming out on these people. There's a great new book called Chinese in Britain, which was written by a non-academic, in fact, but it's beautifully researched. It's someone whose kind of background is family, local history, and just finding out so much material about these 18th century Chinese who are settling in Britain. And there's another one who comes in who's a kind of semi-interpreter, a guy called Ho Chi, whose family donated some of his materials to the Bodleian recently. And so he's a Chinese person who comes over around 1816, ends up as a gentleman farmer, comes over as a servant, but basically financial manager for one of the people involved in the East India Company, inherits land from him, becomes a gentleman farmer, and left his money to an almshouse in Sussex. The Ho Chi almshouses still exist. Small, but with a marble bust of Ho Chi. So part of this book was about saying there isn't this huge gap that we see that Adrian talked about in the kind of standard narratives between China on the one hand and the West on the other, with kind of no knowledge. There are actually lots and lots of people coming backwards and forwards all the time. I think I'll leave the parenting talk unless...
That gets to your point. I mean, that you also bring up, it's this individuated familiarity that doesn't translate into a larger familiarity that we repeatedly see. That the familiarity, for example, in the UK vis-a-vis the United States is so different than China, even though individually the amount of those individual ties are also so dense.
Yes, exactly. We have absolutely tight people who are going from one to the other. But particularly in the 18th century, one of the problems is that a lot of the people who go from one to the other are sailors and people of relatively low social class. So, and so that's one level of problems, that elite people at all times like reading things in books. We know you're that kind of person because you've turned up to this talk and would like to read a book and learning things from books. But there's also, but sometimes knowledge isn't the kind of thing that you can learn from books, and particularly language learning is best learnt, is often best learnt implicitly. And particularly language learning for this very, very high level interpreting is often best learned in children with these very tight personal relationships. And that's still the case with, we run a Chinese degree, but many of the people who do top level interpreting for China will be people who've lived lives across the two, whose lives have taken them from early childhood between the two countries, because that gets you to the absolutely top level. Though you still need the people on either side who can understand what's going on.
Just before I hand over to, something that Todd said that I also want to respond, because the other thing that's fascinating in this is that William Sewell, again I'll refer to, of course, was a prominent figure in the sort of linguistic turn in historical studies. And of course, historians often also are using language in a slightly different way from English or Chinese, but also languages of ideology, of politics, exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about. So in fact, actually, there's often within these questions of translation, it's not just about, if you like, the underlying language, but the languages within the language. 18th century classical allusion in Europe, or particular theological terms may also be feeding into the worldview and the understanding. And just as today, Marxist, Maoist specific language has a very particular technical meaning. So I think that's another sort of fascinating thing that's going on here, which is the class and ideological assumptions of particular registers of language.
Yes, and actually I think it's particularly this whole issue that the Chinese government has had in the past, where it had Confucian ideology and it debated policy in terms of Confucian ideology, which often made that policy sound very unrealistic. Should we take the loose or the tight rein, like reins of a horse, approach to barbarians on our frontier? It sounds like a very... actually, it has real political resonance at that point, and there were real policies you might adopt if you were doing that. But it's discussed in these kind of tags that people are adjusted to, and the same is true of socialism in China now, which is discussed in terms of tags like struggle, which come from that a socialist mindset, and might actually be more accessible to Westerners who had a strong training in Marxism, but are not necessarily so accessible to the general public.
Okay, I think at this point, I'm sure there are questions from the audience. I will apologise that I think apart from Craig, I don't know who anyone is. But I'd like to throw this open to the floor with questions for Henrietta.
So we talked about 4 different countries. Adrian talked about 4 different
4 languages and 5 countries.
Yes, but actually 2 of the languages are in one of the archives. But I think it is interesting, because one of the actual scholarly contributions of this book is that it brings together research from different archival traditions. So the Chinese state has an amazing set of archives. The #1 archives in China for the Qing dynasty are stupendous. They're huge, and people who work on them usually spend their whole careers working on them. They're specialists in the history of the Qing dynasty. They very often are not particularly fluent in foreign languages, because this is an extraordinary... I recently come back from Taiwan, and I was talking to Lai Huimin, who is one of the big scholars of Qing finance, and she has really spent her whole career reading slowly through the finance ministry archives, literally file by file, as she writes books on it. And that is a very specific kind of knowledge, and in order to deal with that, then there's the archives of the Vatican, and particularly the Propaganda Fide in Rome, which is the Vatican's mission now, the Congregation for the Evangelization of the Peoples. And that archive contains in it all the letters sent from missionaries and Chinese priests in China. And those letters are written in Latin or Italian, depending in which language that. So the Chinese and the Dutch write Latin, because nobody counts Dutch or Chinese as proper languages, but Italians write Italian. And some Chinese like Li Zibiao can write Italian, but he was unusual in that. So that archive is a multilingual, and then people sometimes write in French, and nowadays they write in English in that archive. But that's another archive which has its own specialist, and there are loads of people who work on the history of the Catholic Church, and it's a very specific specialist topic. And then there's the archives of the trade. So the Sino-British trade has these amazing archives, which I haven't even hardly touched on, because all I looked at was the East India Company, the British East India Company records, and those were in the British Library when I was doing it, but now available to us all online. It's amazing. But there were also the Dutch East India Company archives, Swedish archives, and French ones, which I didn't use for this. And I currently have a student, Jacob Fordham, writing a fantastic dissertation based on the Portuguese archives from Macau. And those archives for the trade are not used by the Chinese scholars in China who work on the Qing dynasty, because the linguistic requirements are really big. They're in handwritten multiple European languages. So the people who have the training to do Qing dynasty history, I mean, there will be a new generation of Chinese scholars in China who there are now Chinese young people studying at like UCL in the Italian department. I know they have very good Chinese students. There are lots of people from China now studying overseas who are really working up these European languages to a high level. It's not necessarily the same people who are in Chinese history, and certainly so far that archive, so that you can find out stuff about the kind of backstory of Qing officials, which you can link to the Qing archives. But people have not been doing that. And I have tried reading Portuguese, and it was not a success. It's really significantly different. My first degree was in classics, so my Latin is cheerful and my Italian can cope, but Portuguese was beyond me. And so that set of archives is just massive. So there's so much more we could still do. So obviously the kind of core to this is the existence of interpreters. So there has been a tendency. So I started from a historiography which tends to say these two China and the West are very, very distant. And actually, one of the things I wanted to look at was actually the many people, and Li Zibiao and George Thomas Staunton are the two central people, and it's a biography of them. But there are lots and lots of other people who, it turns out, are multilingual in this. So, and therefore, what I was primarily interested in was how they became the kind of people who learned languages. So I was, so George Thomas Staunton, George Leonard Staunton is the father and George Thomas Staunton is the son. And George Leonard Staunton was very influenced by these kind of Enlightenment ideas. And he believed in teaching languages by total immersion for his child, which was very strange at that moment. So there were people like Macartney who picked up Italian on the Grand Tour, and that was completely the thing. And that was how people did it really before they went in for classroom training. It was much more a sort of oral acquisition, an implicit knowledge mode. Because you have to argue for that if you're going to say there were these people in between, because it's clear that there aren't textbooks, there aren't dictionaries. George Thomas Staunton translates the whole Qing legal code before the writing of a Chinese-English dictionary. So, I mean, these people are getting this language in those kind of implicit methods without textbooks by learning in childhood. So I think that was but I was endlessly trying to, and I wanted to show that these people were educated, particularly Li Zibiao. With Li Zibiao, the literature, such as it was, and it was very little that existed on him before, really was tended to be by Chinese scholars of translation studies, and they tended to say, well, he didn't speak English, which obviously he didn't, so he was no use as an interpreter. And that's obviously a problematic thing if everybody's happy to talk either Italian or Latin. But also they tended to rate him as a quite low social status person, whereas it's very clear from the way the embassy treats him that he's treated as a gentleman. And the reason, and that's completely obvious when because I started this project because I was in the Vatican writing a book about a single Chinese Catholic village and how it from 1700 to now, and the story of this Catholic village. And I found Li Zibiao's letters, Jacobus Lee, and I was completely fascinated by them. And he's an incredibly beautiful writer of Latin. Most Chinese priests write really poor Latin, very basic. And here's this Chinese priest writing extremely fluent, expressive Latin. And so I was and lots of them, and all about the Macartney embassy, which is very famous. So I got enthusiastic to study about that. But if you come at it from this level, it's clear he's a gentleman, and they treat him as a gentleman. And so he's part of that elite world because of the nature of the education he had, because the Chinese college in Naples where he studied was a bit like an Oxford college, which had been set up with a very specific remit, Chinese and Ottoman students, and it had needed to fund itself, and it had taken in private students as well. And it had a great deal of fine dining and a lot of high-level education. And I had to leave this out of the book, but I did indeed have many things that didn't go in. But one of the things they were famous for was operatic performances. Back in the day, they the boys at the school put on these very grand performances of opera, which were much enjoyed by the Neapolitan elite. So that was about wanting to show how integrated these people really were. Yes, so and I think that's true fairly universally. That's not just true about China, is that you need to find someone. So there is this moment when the British take some boys to Canton and sort of dump them there to learn the language, and it's one of them does quite well. And in fact, two of them did quite well. But those ones don't learn to read and write. So it turns out that George Leonard Staunton is just much the most ambitious. So he really wants his son to be able to read and write, and it's reading and writing Chinese right from the start. And it's the Chinese language as spoken in Beijing, the Mandarin, the dialect used by the court. So Staunton never learns Cantonese, which is the language spoken in the part of China he ends up living quite many years in. He only ever learns the Mandarin dialect. So yes, but that would be true of French. So if you think about it, if you think of like late 19th century French lessons, girls still learnt languages by having in fact, my granny had a German governess. And, back in the day, you had some
bombs. I think they all carried bombs apparently. Sorry, First World War historian.
Yes, well, it would have been about the time of the First World War. So, but because boys learnt languages in school on the model of learning Latin from the mid-19th century, but girls continued to learn Latin by immersive methods, to learn languages by immersive methods. But that was kind of downgraded as an acceptable way of learning languages. And we now think that that's a less good way of learning languages than if we taught people in classes, whereas that's not actually true. To get to the very highest levels, classes are obviously good, and certainly to read classical Chinese, you're going to have classes from somewhere or some kind of structured learning experience. Well, though that George Staunton did it all by discussion, but he did use a lot of Chinese reference works. He came back with like 3,000 volumes of Chinese reference works when he came back to the UK, which mostly now in the Brotherton Library in Leeds.
Can I ask one question? I mean, I was very interested in your thoughts on the historian versus the interpreter, because of course you had to translate and you had to do so much, and it's not just interpretation of the words per se, it's also the era. I mean, you're speaking to an audience that is of course of a different era and in a very different worldview. And so I was wondering too if you had any thoughts about the historian as interpreter.
Yeah, and also the interpreter as the shaper of history. So the thing I had most thoughts about, obviously as a historian, you struggle with this every time you try, because I was quite often writing in the book about people translating from Latin into Chinese. So all the words involved have to be translated into English for the benefit of the English reading audience. And I was also thinking quite a lot when I wrote, the book is being translated into Chinese and I knew that would happen. So I was also thinking when I was writing about the potential for translating this onwards, and what would happen to those Latin words when they went through English into Chinese, and the complexities of that. So I think, yes, you do think about that, but the thing that most strikes me about that is that I ended up very convinced by Staunton. So one of the troubles of doing biography is that in the end, you become fond of I mean, Staunton wasn't a very attractive person in many ways. Zibiao was a very, very high quality Catholic priest and of high moral stature, an excellent person. Staunton was not someone most people find very easy. He had good qualities, but he was shy and difficult, and you know, and not a very good speaker. When he tried to give a speech in the House of Parliament, everyone walked out, and the House of Parliament became inquorate, and it was this just massive humiliation. You know, not a chap who got on all that well with his contemporaries. However, you kind of get to know someone, and by the time I ended the book, I ended up very convinced by his line on what was the problem with Britain and China. And his line on what was the problem with Britain and China is the line that I take in the book, which is that the problem for the Qing dynasty with Britain is the threat of naval aggression. And it's not big cultural differences, and the Chinese are not just imagining that we're going to admire their heavenly enthroned emperor. And he has this great thing, which I put in right at the beginning, is that they're not such drivellers in politics. You know, he knew that they were very tough negotiators. He knew that they were pretty clued up. But what he sees as the problem is the growing British naval threat. And yes, so I think in a way your subjects in the end get to you.
So really the issue is that it's not that the Chinese misunderstand Britain, but they understand it far too well. Okay, I think that might be a good moment for us to finish. Thank you very much for everybody who's been here. Thank you, Henrietta. It was an absolute joy, as ever, to hear you talking about your work.
Thank you very much.